Welcome to the Torah Guide, a podcast where we explore how the Hebrew Bible is all about Jesus and meditate on what it has to say to us. I'm your host, Aaron Dranoff. Moses is one of the most important people in Jewish history. He's one of the most important people in the Bible. I mean, these are the final words of the Torah. Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, for all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. The Torah ends like that. The Torah ends by reminding us how special Moses was. This is nice for Moses, but it's a super disappointing note to end the Torah on. Like, you know Moses, the guy who we focus on for the last 4 books, one of the towering figures of the Torah? Yep, there's never been anyone like him again ever since. That's a downer. And as you'd probably guess, the final words of the Torah are super important. They were carefully placed here by the narrator to launch us into the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to take a look at why this ending is so important. But it won't really make any sense unless we know who Moses is, what he was chosen to do, and what his place is. Not just to Israel and with the law code, but his place as a descendant of Abraham, who, remember, God promised that his descendants were chosen as part of undoing this whole curse that's corrupting creation with suffering and death. So that's what we're going to talk about. Our mission is to look at Moses as he's presented in the Torah. I'm going to take us on a broad overview of Moses' story, and I'll try to be a good tour guide, pointing out some of the key moments that should stand out in the story. There are so many moments in Moses' life that are central to the biblical story, so we definitely can't hit all the important moments. So we're just going to try to take a stop at some of these key moments that are central to why the author chose to close the Torah by reminding us about him. Before we jump in, I want to ask you, is the Torah Guide helping you understand the Hebrew Bible or grow in your faith? I really hope it is. The Torah Guide is a totally crowd-funded nonprofit, and right now we're raising funds to be able to continue the podcast and the animated videos into next year. Several of you have signed up to give, and I just want to thank you. This really is a team project, and I want to thank you for being part of this team. If you're enjoying the podcast and you haven't signed up to give yet, please prayerfully consider signing up to give whatever monthly amount you're able to. You can give at thetorahguide.com/give. Thank you. So remember, the reason we're talking about Moses is because we're in a series where we're tracking the design of the Hebrew Bible. And let's just take a moment and summarize what we've uncovered so far. So we've noticed that the Jewish people are in the spotlight for almost the entire Hebrew Bible, except for the first 11 chapters. And what we've learned from those first 11 chapters is that humanity has a serious problem. And so does the entire world. Creation is filled with all kinds of death and evil because humanity persistently rejects God in each generation. And then in chapter 12, Abraham and his family, the Jewish people, are the first step towards solving that problem. So the origin story of the Jewish people is God raising up Abraham as a new human, or a new Adam, a new Adam, to bring blessing to a world corrupted by the curse that the first Adam brought. It's clearly stated that the Jewish people are supposed to shape their lives around the Torah. And the Torah is made up of 2 sections that hinge around God giving a law code to the people of Israel, Abraham's descendants. And last week we talked about how Moses didn't get to take his people into the land because he failed to trust God, to treat him as holy. So instead he died in the wilderness. But that doesn't mean Moses didn't live a faithful life. In fact, he had a very special relationship with the God of Israel. So we've already spent a lot of time talking about how Abraham is introduced to the story as the first step of bringing blessing out of the curse, which is the biblical language for saying he's the resolution to the problem of evil and death. But we've only barely talked about the other towering figure in the story, Moses. Once the story gets to Moses, everything slows down. Moses is introduced as a baby in the beginning of Exodus, and he stays in the spotlight for the rest of the Torah, which actually ends with his death. Moses first appeared as a baby who should have died. Pharaoh ordered that all male Israelite babies be drowned in the Nile River. But God delivered Moses through those deadly waters in a little ark. Most English translations say basket, but it's the same word in the original language used about that floating thing that God delivered Noah through death in. It's teva, an ark. This is the main literary technique in the Hebrew Bible. The story over and over again from Genesis 2 through the end of 2 Kings shifts the spotlight from one person to the next and introduces them in terms of people that came before them, all stemming from Adam. And we're supposed to lay those stories side by side and compare and contrast how each one fits into the larger narrative. So Moses here is a new Noah who God delivered through the waters of death in an ark, at a time when Israelite babies were specifically being slaughtered in the Nile River. Then something happens to Moses that's a lot like what happened to Joseph in the story right before this one. Moses was lifted up into Pharaoh's house and raised there as an Egyptian. Now, even though he was experiencing all the royalty of life in the ruler's house, Pharaoh's house, he didn't see that as something to hold on to. So he humbled himself by identifying with his people who were in slavery under Pharaoh. Moses left his position to fight for Israel, but it wasn't received well. Actually, Moses murdered an Egyptian, and then one of his Israelite brothers rejected Moses. He said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." And the matter did become known. Pharaoh heard about it and tried to kill Moses, who ran away. Later, God appeared to Moses miraculously in the famous story of the burning bush, and God called him, a lot like how he called Abraham earlier on. Now, this call moment is where God calls Moses in order to do two things. One, free his people from slavery, and two, reveal himself, who he is. He tells Moses that he's heard the cry of his people in bondage, and he sends Moses to go confront Pharaoh. Then Moses asks the question, "Who should I tell them sent me?" And God tells Moses his name in an intense and important moment in the Hebrew Bible. We could spend a lot of time talking about this moment. It's a very important rabbit hole that you should spend a lot of time meditating on. But what I want to point out here is that God chose to reveal his name through Moses. Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I'll say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' Now they may say to me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "This is what you shall say to the sons of Israel. I am has sent me to you." God furthermore said to Moses, "This is what you shall say to the sons of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is the name for all generations to use to call upon me." Exodus 4:13-15. Then after that, there's some back and forth between Moses and God. Moses actually resists God a little bit. He makes excuses 3 times. First, he says, "What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.'" God's response to Moses' resistance was to show Moses 3 wonders. Now, what you'll notice about these wonders is that they're acts of God. God doing something that would be impossible if it wasn't someone who is more powerful than creation. We call them miracles a lot of the time, but Scripture talks about them as signs and wonders. So thinking about them in that terminology will be helpful for us to make some important connections. At least that's been my experience. So for the first wonder, God tells Moses to throw his staff on the ground, and it becomes a serpent. I wonder if serpents are important in this story. Oh yeah, on page 3 of the story, Adam and Eve listened to a serpent instead of listening to God, and now the whole rest of the Bible is about us waiting for one of their descendants to crush the serpent. Genesis 3:15, "And I will make enemies of you and the woman, and of your offspring and her descendant. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." That's God talking to the serpent, promising that one of Adam and Eve's descendants, is going to crush the serpent. So Adam and Eve listened to a serpent and corrupted the world with a curse. God promised to use one of their descendants to undo that curse, saying he'll crush the serpent and be crushed in return. Abraham, one of Adam's descendants, was the first step in undoing that curse. God promised Abraham to use his descendants to bless all the families of the ground that was cursed. Now Moses, one of Abraham's descendants, one of these people, who's part of bringing blessing to the people who are cursed from the ground because of Adam, throws his staff on the ground and it turns into a serpent. And then here's what happened. So he threw it on the ground and it turned into a serpent, and Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out with your hand and grasp it by its tail." So he reached out with his hand and caught it, and it turned into a staff in his hand, so that they may believe the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Exodus 4, 4-5. God has Moses, who's initially afraid, handle a serpent, and because he can do that, the people should know that God appeared to him. Then God showed Moses another wonder, having control over sickness and healing. God showed Moses healing from leprosy. Then God told Moses, "If this doesn't work, pour water on the ground and it'll turn into blood." Now it's important to see and remember what these wonders are. Handling a snake, healing sickness, specifically leprosy, and turning water into blood. And it's important to notice that God isn't teaching Moses how to do anything. It's not like Moses is performing some secret formula that's causing anything to happen. He's just listening to God, and God is the one actually causing things to happen. Moses actually still resisted God's instruction 2 more times after this, because instead of trusting God, he's afraid of his own weaknesses. And when he didn't listen to God that 3rd time, God got angry with him and raised up someone else, Moses' brother, to do the speaking for Moses. Again, this is a really typical pattern in the Hebrew Bible. When someone doesn't listen to God's instruction, God raises up someone else to accomplish what they were supposed to do. So because Moses didn't listen to God 3 times, God gave that part of the job to Aaron and told Moses, "So you are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I myself will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will instruct you in what you are to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. And you shall take in your hand this staff with which you will perform the signs." Exodus 4, 15-17. Now Aaron is Moses' mouthpiece, just like Moses is God's mouthpiece to Aaron. And Moses is like God to Aaron, and Moses is supposed to use the staff as God instructed him in order to perform the signs and wonders. But really, God is actually doing the signs and wonders. Moses is just doing what he's told. So then Moses went back to Egypt and confronted Pharaoh, which was a process, but what happened is Pharaoh repeatedly said no. So God kept doing wonders through Moses. The first wonder, and the final wonder, map right back on to Pharaoh murdering the Israelite babies in the Nile River. The first wonder is the Nile and all the water in Egypt turns to blood, as if the blood of the murdered babies are testifying against Pharaoh. There's a repeated motif in the Hebrew Bible that the blood of the innocent cries out to God. This first happens when Cain kills his brother Abel in Genesis 4. And this is very similar in Exodus 1. God hears Israel crying out. So when we find out that God's first wonder in Egypt is turning their water, specifically the Nile, into blood, it becomes clear that this is mapping into that larger motif in the Hebrew Bible, that God heard the blood of the innocent crying out, and he's coming down to bring justice. This is to rescue his people from bondage, but it's not just about that. It's about God bringing justice for the innocent. But Pharaoh refused to repent and seek forgiveness from Yahweh, the Lord. So Yahweh keeps striking Egypt, and in the final blow of judgment, he kills all the firstborn in Egypt. Which again, hopefully you can see the connection to Pharaoh murdering all the babies. But what Pharaoh does is he murders them indiscriminately, whereas God kills the firstborn. Then God uses Moses to deliver Israel through a deadly sea, and in that sea kills the Egyptian army. From this point on, the rest of Moses' story takes place in the wilderness. God gave Moses the law to give Israel, and the people repeatedly complain against and even disobey Moses. And Moses gets angry at the people more than once, but he also repeatedly prays that God would have mercy on them for what they've done. In one of the more bitter moments of betrayal that Moses experienced, in Numbers 12, Moses' own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, question his authority. They lower Moses' position and try to elevate themselves. Now, instead of Moses responding to Aaron and Moses, the narrator turns to the reader and he tells you, "Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." And then it picks right back up, resuming into the story. But instead of Moses defending himself, God steps in. Now, God considers speaking against Moses to be such a serious thing that he steps forward himself to defend Moses. And you can feel the intensity as you read it. He calls all three of them, to meet him at the tent. At once, the Lord said to Moses, "Aaron and Miriam, come out to the tent of meeting, all three of you." So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, "Listen to my words." And then he explains the difference between Moses and other prophets. He says, "If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. It is not this way for my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, that is, openly, and not using mysterious language. And he beholds the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. God says Moses is different because he is faithful. God speaks openly with him, and he sees the form of God. It's important to see that he connects the faithfulness to his special relationship with Moses. I hope that you're seeing how faith is a priority to the author. Remember last week, Abraham was counted righteous because of his faith? So God said, "It's not this way for my servant Moses." And he said, "With him, I speak mouth to mouth, that is, openly and not using mysterious language." So God speaks more openly with Moses, and he adds, Moses gets to see the form of Yahweh. He said, "And he beholds the form of Yahweh." Now, this is referring to a few different things, but it's most directly referring to a really significant moment in Exodus 33, when Moses asked to see the glory of God, and God said that Moses couldn't see his face, but he apparently would let him see from behind. It's for these reasons that God tells Aaron, the high priest, and Miriam, know that they should have been afraid to speak out against Moses. It's a bad idea to speak out against someone as close to God as Moses is. Then after this happened, it says the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. And when he leaves, Miriam was left with leprosy, to the point that it says she was like a dead person. And Moses, the person she betrayed, intercedes for her. He cries out to God for him to heal Miriam. He doesn't reject her or leave her stranded. Now, remember that detail in the beginning of the episode, right before God defended Moses, that the narrator turned to you and told you, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any person who was on the face of the earth." How was Moses humble? We can think of a few things. For sure, in the beginning of Moses' life, he gave up a life of royalty in order to associate with his people who were in slavery. That's a big sacrifice. That's humble. But the narrator brings it up at this point for a reason. He placed the description of Moses as the most humble man at this moment to connect it to Moses in this story. Moses had already been being rejected and complained against over and over again, and this rejection or mutiny has been creeping up the ranks of Israel. First, the people as a whole complained against him, then the leaders of the tribes, the Levites, and now even the high priest and a prophetess, Moses' own siblings, speak out against him. This is the point when the narrator turns and tells us Moses was really humble. He was the most humble man on the face of the earth. It's in association with Moses being rejected by even the leaders of the people, who he has time and time again interceded for, that Moses is called the most humble man. What is Moses' response to his people rejecting him? Here he doesn't respond. God responds with judgment because it's a big deal to reject God's chosen representative, especially one who has such a close relationship with God. Now, God actually treats rejecting Moses to be the same thing as rejecting God himself. In Exodus 16, when the people all spoke out against him and Aaron, God said they were really speaking out against God. So what does Moses do here? With his sister who betrayed him and spoke out against him, trying to seize the authority that God gave him for herself? Moses, the most humble man on the face of the land, prayed for her healing, so that what she did would not be held against her. There's a lot to process in Moses' story, and we've only just scratched the surface. So let's meditate on what we've learned. God takes evil seriously. When Pharaoh murdered the babies of Israel and mistreated the people in slavery, God brought justice. God chose Moses to free his people from bondage and slavery, and to reveal himself to Israel and all people. Moses and God had such an intimate relationship that rejecting Moses was treated as rejecting God. But Moses was a humble man who continually interceded and prayed for his people who rejected and mistreated him. Numbers 12, 6 through 9. He said, "Now hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. It is not this way for my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, that is, openly, and not using mysterious language. And he beholds the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" Numbers 12, 6 through 9. Let's meditate on Scripture together. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Take some time to think about each question, and you can pause if you need some extra time to think or to pray. First question: who is someone in your life who has questioned your worth or mistreated you? What was your response to being mistreated or unappreciated? Did you lash out or hope they got what they deserved? Or did you sincerely ask God to forgive this person and to do good to them? And last, take comfort in knowing that God hears the cries of the innocent and he sees all the evil and suffering that everyone does, and God will bring justice on anyone who doesn't turn away from their evil and seek his forgiveness. Pray with me. God, we're so glad that you are the final and ultimate judge. You are a just God who knows all, and you hear the cry of the innocent and you respond. Thank you for your forgiveness. Every one of us is guilty, but you have provided someone to intercede for us so that we don't need to stay guilty. Thank you for that. But not everyone has turned away from evil and accepted your forgiveness. There's still so many corrupt people doing evil in the world, and we've been hurt deeply by those people. We're hurting, and our communities are hurting. We ask you to forgive them, God. Please let the people who have hurt us hear the good news that they don't need to be condemned, but can be forgiven if they turn away from their ways and trust you. And if they don't turn away, we trust you as a righteous judge. Amen. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Torah Guide podcast. If you want to meditate on this lesson some more, check out the video and reading plan that go along with it, either at thetorahguide.com or on Instagram and Facebook. The Torah Guide is a totally crowdfunded nonprofit that makes all sorts of resources to help you read the Hebrew Bible and discover Jesus, including this podcast, animated videos, devotionals, reading plans, and more. And we're able to do it because of generous people like you. So if you want to be a part of helping people discover how the Hebrew Bible points to Jesus, you can sign up to become a monthly supporter or make a one-time gift at thetorahguide.com/give.